Okay, everyone, we can make a start. So this lecture, what we want to do is explore symbolic interactionism. So we've covered this in a brief fashion somewhat previously. If we're looking at symbolic interactionism, can anyone tell me what that entails? What is symbolic interactionism in its simplest sense? So when we say this is a micro approach, what do we mean? What are we looking at? So thus far, the focus has obviously been on the structuralist type approach, where we're looking at functionalism, conflict theory, as a way to understand society. But now we want to look at this kind of method of symbolic interactionism, which is very much looking at the micro processes in society. So what can we learn? What can we understand from the social interactions and the relationships between people? So it's not about really these kind of the institutions and the social norms that govern behavior, but we want to understand how people create meaning through interaction. And this is the kind of focus of symbolic interactionism. Okay, so the first point that we need to start at is to look at two things: pragmatism and the Chicago School. And the reason for that is because symbolic interactionism is grounded within these two things, right? So we need to start here. So historically, if we look at pragmatism formed, or it was kind of conceived of as an approach in the 1870s by Charles Peirce. Now, what he constructed, and the whole idea of pragmatism was constructed in kind of reaction against abstract rationalism. So any idea what we mean by abstract rationalism? So in essence, pragmatism is a response to abstract rationalism. So in its simplest sense, abstract rationalism is the idea that reason and logic can be used to extract and understand truth. So the source of truth has to be acquired through the process of reason and logic. And ultimately, it utilizes abstract principles. Now, rationalism, and abstract rationalism more importantly, advocates the idea that truth is innate. All right? So it's an innate thing. And so what we need to do is basically extract that truth. So what that means is, in essence, your sensory experience, i.e. what you sense in the outside world, the social reality, is not that important. Rather, truth is innate and it requires the rational logic to extract it. So in essence, abstract rationalism doesn't value empirical kind of studies of the social world. It doesn't value sensory experience. Now, that means basically, abstract rationalism is you sitting kind of in your room and constructing kind of abstract conceptions of things. So if you were tasked with the idea, I don't know, what is the origin of religion, you might kind of perform some kind of abstract idea that, it's based on certain kind of needs and things, and you're basically deriving it from your point of reason, but based on no experience, no empirical data. So pragmatism then is this reaction to that, and basically is focused on worldly experience. So if rationalism is very much about detaching yourself from the social reality, pragmatism is based on basically understanding and kind of trying to understand the lived experience, the kind of social reality. So it's completely different kind of perspective, right? So it's real world experience is pragmatism. And hence, there is this kind of maxim within pragmatism that basically suggests to understand a concept, you must understand its practical effect. So to understand something, to understand a concept, requires understanding its practical effect. So in essence, you don't look at things in the abstract, you need to understand. So if you want to study drugs or crime in a place, or poverty, then these social issues can't be looked at in an abstract way. They have to be looked at through the lens of people that are experiencing them. So if you don't speak with, let's say, drug addicts and these people, how are you going to gain an understanding of the problems that they experience, their lived experience? You can't abstractly understand their reality. So it requires engaging, interviewing, discussing, and understanding the social world that they live within. And that is really what pragmatism is about. Now, if we look at it, the Chicago School was established in 1890s. Now, the focus initially of the Chicago School was to study urban environments. That was its focus, the study of urban environments. Any understanding perhaps why? Why was the focus the study of the urban environment, which then grows into things like urban sociology? So a good insight is actually in the city of Chicago. In Chicago, in 1850, the population of Chicago was around 10,000. By 1910, the population grew to 2 million. So that's rapid growth through migration, through urbanization, through industrialization. So in essence, Chicago went from a small town to a large, rapidly growing metropolis, a huge city. So in essence, what you need to understand here then is that Chicago, the people, the population, the city, went through this upheaval, this transformation. So then the question then is, if all of these things are happening, this rapid change to this one place, then how does it stabilize? How do people kind of make sense of it? So in essence, what are the problems that come? So when we have modern Chicago forming, we have housing crisis, we have poverty, we have lack of resources, we have lack of jobs. So all of these things are complex urban problems, yeah? And so in essence, the Chicago School wanted to try to understand the whole issue of urban environments, how people then can solve these kind of issues. Now, by the 1920s, we had basically the establishment of the second Chicago School, where we do then have symbolic interactionism coined and articulated, and this approach starts to become significant. Hence, it's known as the second Chicago School. So, just to touch on the issue of pragmatism again. So, pragmatism, importantly, articulates basically truth as a process. So it states truth is a process. Now, what does that mean? Truth is a process. So importantly, this conception that is truth is not static. What do we mean that truth is not static? So truth basically evolves according to our experiences. So truth evolves according to our experiences. So a silly example perhaps is, let's take for example Santa Claus. As children, most of us growing up in this society are told, and we have a truth, that Santa Claus is real, right? That's a truth that we acquire from our parents. It's reinforced by perhaps programs that we watch, and so we perform actions based on this truth. So we expect basically Santa Claus to come the day before and give presents to everyone. So you might put cookies and milk out for Santa Claus, and so you believe that That is a truth that you believe as a young child because you've been told that truth. And so that is your truth. However, that's not a static truth. That truth is subject to revision. So your knowledge is subject to revision as you grow older and experience other things. So as your knowledge and your social world grows, truths change. So in essence, so when you become an adult, you don't believe, obviously, that Santa Claus, in the way it was conceived to you, is real. So what this suggests is that your thoughts, your actions are very much dependent upon experience. So there is this interconnectedness between what we believe, our actions, and the whole aspect of experience. This is why the Chicago School focused on this concept, the lived experience. So in essence, when it came to application of the Chicago School, what it wanted to do was understand the real social world, the real social issues of people, and it was through the lens of their lived experience. What are the problems they encounter? What are the issues? How do they overcome them? So it's very much about trying to understand the lived experience of individuals. So this is why, again, it was vehemently opposed to abstract rationalism. How are you going to understand the experiences of a new migrant coming to a large population without kind of studying their experiences, interviewing them? You can't look at it in an abstract fashion. It requires understanding their lived social world, right? So in many ways, the Chicago School, what it did very initially was to study neighborhoods, because they argued that social environments have a huge impact on our behavior. So the way we act, the way we behave, is very much a byproduct of our interactions with social environments. So this is why a large part of the Chicago School focused on migration, which makes sense because during this period, Chicago was going through this transformation through the process of migration. And what they discovered was that when migrants arrive, initially what happens is they are faced or presented with a host of challenges, right? Lack of housing. How do I get housing? How do I get a job? So they encounter all these social problems. And obviously this can lead to conflict with other migrant groups who are competing for the same resources, housing and jobs. And over a period of time, what happens and what they discovered is you have accommodation and assimilation. So they created models of how migrants arrive and become assimilated in the host society through examining this whole issue of the lived experience. So it's central to the Chicago School. Are there any questions so far? Cool. Okay, so our first glimpse at symbolic interactionism then. And we're going to expand on these 3 points when we look at Herbert Blumer in more detail. But he basically states, and describing, in essence, social interactionism, symbolic interactionism, he basically states, humans act toward things on the basis of the meanings they ascribe to those things. The meaning of such things is derived from or arise out of the social interaction that one has with others and society. These meanings are handled in and modified through an interpretive process used by the person in dealing with the things he or she encounters. What is he trying to say here? What are some of the main points? So there are 3 significant aspects to his explanation. So when you're talking about meaning, so we're talking about how do we acquire meaning. Okay, it's very fundamental to understanding processes within society. So there are 3 aspects to meaning. There is the ascribed aspect. So the first aspect is the ascribed meaning. The second is to do with the construction of meaning. and the third is the interpretive process of meaning. Okay, so we have to kind of explain these, right? So, if we take some examples, if someone is wearing a wedding ring, yeah, we know that that symbol carries meaning, right? So, in essence, if you took off this ring, what is this ring? This ring is just a metal, yeah? It's just a piece of metal. And yet, that metal obviously has no inherent value. It has no inherent meaning. So how did it acquire meaning? How do we know when someone wears a wedding band on a particular finger that it means something, that it carries meaning? That wedding ring means that they are basically in a relationship. They have companionship. They're married, right? So the object carries meaning because there is this shared conception, this shared meaning of that act, of that symbol. So a better example is, obviously, I think I might have mentioned this before, the example of a tree, right? So let's say you have a tree, and the first point that we want to understand is how meaning is ascribed to objects and things through interaction, through experience. So let's say you've got one individual, let's just call him individual B, and you've got another individual A, right? A and B, two people. Now, individual A on a hot sunny day goes to a tree and basically sits under the tree and reads a book and has a very enjoyable day. And so what he ascribes to the tree is that this tree is good. It sheltered me from the sun. I had a relaxing time sitting underneath it. I enjoyed the tree. So the object, which has no value, has no meaning. The tree has no inherent meaning, but the individual, through his experience with the object, his interaction with the object, gives it meaning. So he says this is good, right? But then you have person B, who the next day, on another sunny hot day, goes and sits under the tree, but then basically is attacked by ants and is bitten all over by ants. Now, he goes away and says, I'm never sitting under a tree again. It was terrible. So his experience and interaction with the tree is different, and he says the tree is bad. Now, what we have is the one object, the exact same object, the tree, which is neutral, has no inherent meaning, but we have two people in the social world that have ascribed two very different meanings to the tree. So one thinks it's good, one thinks it's bad. So what is that based on? It's based on their interaction with the object and the experience with that object. So the meaning that we ascribe and we give to objects is ascribed based on experience and interaction. So this then leads us to that second point, that meaning then is constructed. Yeah? So we construct the meaning. So in essence, we assign, so person A assigned the value that this was good, and person B assigned the value that this was bad. So we have a difference. So that difference in assigning value suggests that meaning is constructed. Yeah? That they have constructed their own conception, their own value, their own meaning to the exact same object. So this is why meaning can be so important, and it impacts how we interact. So imagine his interaction with the tree and other people, and how he'll describe it will be radically different to how the other person describes it. So again, what we see is the construction of meaning that comes from it. So you could take many different things and many different examples. So take, for example, I don't know, the concept of friendship, right? Friendship as a concept might differ from culture to culture, from society to society. So for example, let's say hypothetically, you have one culture believes that friendship is something that is a deep and meaningful thing. So you have a deep commitment. So when you have a friend, you have to show loyalty and a deep commitment to them. That's what friendship is. So that's what their meaning of friendship is. It's a deep commitment. But then go to another society or another place, and their concept of meaning that they assign to friendship is just a casual thing. Now, you've got two kind of meanings about friendship. One is it's a deep commitment. One that suggests that it's just a casual relationship. Now, how do you operate in and navigate in society with that meaning? Is going to be dependent on your construction of it. So, the person that has the view that friendship is deep commitment, when they make friends, they'll be much more different with them. They'll be more committed in their relationship. While the person that believes it's just a casual thing might lose track of friends, might make other friends. So the interactions that they will have with the social world is dictated by that concept of meaning that they have given or ascribed and constructed to friendship, if that makes sense. So what I'm trying to say, the meaning that we have and hold is constructed. And that can impact also our relationships, our interactions, our experiences, right? And then the last point is the issue of the interpretive process. So these meanings are handled in and modified through an interpretive process used by the person in dealing with the things. So in essence, what Blomer is saying is basically we negotiate with our meaning, and we have to basically interpret. And so these interpretations of the same object can be, like we said, good, or it could be bad, and these can impact us in positive and negative ways. So several weeks ago I talked about radicalization and the example of Abu Halima, who basically had a traumatic, if you want to call it a traumatic experience when he was young. 7 years old, he experiences his mum being attacked or verbally, racially abused and pushed to the floor. Now, that interaction, that experience gave him meaning. So that event, so imagine as 8-year-old, you see your mother being pushed to the floor and racially abused. You have to interpret that event. Now, what can happen is that interpretation can give you a basically negative perception of people as a result. So it depends how you interpret it. He could have interpreted it as, look, this is just a one-off situation. Some people in every society have good and bad, and it's just one of those things. And it's not the whole of the populations that's bad or evil. But he's turned against the whole of society as a result of this. So in essence, how we interpret these meanings have an impact. We are going to look at this in a bit more detail anyway, other examples. Okay, so what we want to do is talk about some kind of initial points. So the starting point when we're trying to understand symbolic interactionism is the interrelation of action and consciousness. So we need to understand the interplay between our thinking and our actions. So if we start with thinking, so we know that thinking is the thoughts, the beliefs that we have that form our consciousness, right? Now, in many ways, our understanding of the social world, our interaction with the social world, is going to be very much dependent on the thoughts we have, which will impact our decisions and actions. So let's say, for example, you're a student and you're thinking of joining a protest, right? So it's, let's just say, the Stop the War protest. So you're having to make a decision. Should I join this protest? And so you might have a belief. So you might have a belief in social justice. You might have a belief in pacifism, and you're against war. And so now that meaning that you have, or that belief that you have has been constructed from discussions, from your experiences, from exposure to media and other things. And so we have to make a decision, then you act. And supposedly this is kind of the process, right? So you have thinking and then you have action. Now actions are can be a little bit more complex, because some theorists will believe that actions are essentially stimulated from your kind of instinctual stimuli. So basically, if you're walking down the street and someone jumps out in front of you and you get scared, there's no consciousness, it's just instinct. It's like, whoa, your reaction. It's an act that you're reacting to that environment, that stimuli. That stimuli triggered an emotional act that you're kind of not in too much control of. So it's not necessarily a conscious act, what you did. It's just a purely instinctual, right? But thoughts influence our actions. And they, in many ways, direct our actions. So if we take, for example, I know I've probably talked about environmental kind of examples a lot, but let's just say you've got someone who believes that I want to help save the planet. So their actions will be, okay, I need to reduce my plastic waste. I need to recycle. I need to maybe buy a bag for life and always take that with me to the supermarket. So the thought is directing the action. But when you have thought and action, actions can also create a feedback loop to your thoughts. So what do we mean by that? That there is this feedback loop. So taking, let's say, this example, let's just say that actually there wasn't two people that were interacting with the tree. There was one person A, and he's interacting with the tree. The first day is sunny, enjoyed, and it was a wonderful experience. The next day, because he had such a brilliant experience the first day, he goes back the next day, and this is where he encounters the ants. So what this suggests is that basically, look, on day one, the experience and his thoughts are, this tree is amazing, I've enjoyed myself, I'm going to go back the next day. But then when he's performing the same action of sitting under the tree, he's attacked by the ants. And so that creates a feedback to your thoughts that basically, on Monday, you thought the tree was brilliant. The next day, you think the tree actually is not so brilliant, it has ants, and you've got to be much more now cautious if you try to sit under the tree. So this creates a feedback loop back to your kind of thoughts. Now, the key thing that we want to kind of reflect on is this idea of a problem, which can be the quasi-natural flow of everyday action. What happens when we perform actions that are interrupted? So we're trying to work out the flow of thought to action and action to thought, right? There is an interplay between these things. Now, what happens when we have interruption? Now, some theorists argue that, look, when you operate, there is, yes, your consciousness, but there's also sometimes patterned behavior. So, for example, let's just say, like, when I drive to work, drive to the university, I basically I drive down the exact same route, right? And so when I'm doing that, and I've been doing that for like more than 10 years, driving the exact same route to work, that creates habitual behavior. So when I'm driving here, I'm using very little conscious thought, because it's just second nature. It's the exact same route. I'm not overthinking it, because I know it's the exact same thing I've done for the past 10 years. So it's patterned behavior that I'm functioning on, right? Now, that's perfectly fine. You're doing that with very little conscious thought. What happens when that action of driving to work in the patterned process is interrupted? The flow of the patterned behavior is interrupted. So, for example, last week, there was major roadworks and I had to get here for a 9 o'clock lecture, and there's major roadworks, and what happens? So pattern behavior stops, the habitual behavior transitions to problem solving. So you'll kind of become conscious again. It's like, oh no, there's a problem. I need to now solve the problem. So I need to think alternative routes. How else can I get to the university? So in essence, what happens is there is an interplay between thoughts and actions, but problems and disruption can trigger the social actor into problem solving. And so this is why they talked about the social actor, and that basically there are 4 characteristics when we have an interruption between the flow of thought and action. So in essence, what we have first is the active engagement. So the social actor is actively engaged in the social environment, right? So how are we actively engaged in the social environment? We're constantly making decisions and choices. So you might have a choice after this lecture. Should I go get something to eat? Should I go home? Should I meet my friends? Should I go to the library? These are decisions and choices you have as a social actor. So you're constantly engaging with the environment and the social reality, right? So you're constantly active. So now, let's say, because we're engaged with the social reality, this is where we can encounter problems. So let's say, for example, you own a business on Bangor High Street, right? I think recently the ground rents in the high street were raised, so by about 10%. So now, if you're a small business owner on Bangor High Street, you've basically got your rents that have just gone up by 10%. You now have to basically work out, well, how am I going to pay for that? Do I need to cut costs? What happens? So everything might be operating on a habitual level. You might be doing patterned behavior, and now you encounter a problem as an active agent who's constantly making decisions. Now, that leads then to this idea of problem solving, right? That basically, when we encounter a disruption, a disruption in the flow of thoughts and actions, we have to problem solve. And that can be basically relying on, if you're an individual, all right, so you have the context. This is the social reality you're interacting with. You're engaged in this social reality, you're engaged in this social context. Now, what you have is your knowledge and your experience that you might actualize and draw upon to basically help you solve any problems you encounter. So you're going to encounter problems in your social reality. You're going to encounter disruptions in your social reality. And you draw then upon your knowledge and experience to construct a solution. So this happens all the time. Just a couple of days ago, last weekend, me and my wife were going to go out. We had the babysitter arranged, and she had to cancel last minute. So then we're now panicking. Okay, we've got a problem. We have to go out. We've got a commitment. What do? We need to find an alternative. So you bring friends or family, and you try to problem solve, right? So social actors problem solve. So the third point then is exploring. So social actors constantly look for new possibilities. They're constantly kind of exploring when they encounter disruption. So this is all about how the social actor responds to disruption, to the flow of thoughts and actions. When that process is disrupted, how do we respond? And one aspect of the social actor is that we're constantly exploring and looking at kind of new possibilities. So let's just say you've got a writer and they experience writer's block. So the social actor, he's constantly engaged, he's a writer, he's had a problem, which is he can't write anymore, he's got writer's block. How do you overcome that? Well, we're constantly exploring for solutions. So he might take time away and engage in meditation, and through that process he might gain insight into how to kind of start writing again. So we're constantly kind of exploring. And the last part of this is improvising. So social actors are constantly adapting to the changes of their environment and modifying. All right. Okay, so I just want to run through. I'm not sure how the time has gone so quickly. Okay, so looking at Mead now, we're just going to look at two theorists, Mead and Blomer, and basically focus on them. So he argues that there has to be emphasis on interpersonal action. Now, Mead strongly believes that the self is a social construct. So how is this the case? So if you take the self, how is this a social construct? So your ego, your I consciousness, your basically personality, your identity, which is uniquely you, is the self, but it is a construct of social reality. It is socially constructed. What does that mean? So, in essence, the choices we make, the decisions we make, or the things that we like, from our music, from our food choices, these are all in a social constructed way. Basically, it's exposure, experience to these things that develop our self and develop our likes, dislikes, etc. So, if you take, for example, even things like having a conversation, right? A conversation is an exchange response. So you'll have a conversation with someone, you say something, they say something. This is, again, yourself responding to the social environment. So it's very much, when we're talking about action, there is that kind of interpersonal aspect. The other aspect he talks about, he says, I notice how I affect others. This is your awareness of affecting others. So if we take, for example, let's say, for example, you're a student and you're doing a presentation. Now, when you're doing the presentation, when you're talking to your peers, you'll be aware that you're basically affecting them. So, in essence, there is an interaction that's going place. So, if you're giving the student presentation and they're nodding, that shows that they're agreeing. Or if they're asking questions, they're interacting. All right. So there is, in essence, we are aware that we interact with others, and there is an effect. Yeah, an exchange effect. The third aspect he's talking about here is my agency is reflected to me. So if you take, for example, I don't know, an actor on stage. So an actor, and they're performing a drama on stage, and they're the first time they're doing the play. The first time they're performing, and the actor is really nervous. The lead is really nervous. This is the first time we're doing the play, and so he's extremely nervous. And then he goes on and they perform the play, and if the audience applaud, and they applaud, standing ovation, then that provides kind of positive reinforcement, right? That basically your agency is reflected through that positive praise. So they like the performance, and that can help your confidence. So your confidence then, the next night and the night after, is getting more and more because of the reflected back positive praise that you received. But that can be counterproductive as well. So what happens if you perform the play and they all boo, they hate it? That's going to create self-doubt that, oh, maybe I shouldn't be an actor. So again, the social interactions that we have reflect back upon us. And this then relates to this idea of the self-consciousness that we have. So just imagine if you're going for like a job interview, you're very conscious about, okay, what should I wear? Because you're imagining how will you be perceived, and what will you say will be perceived in a certain way. So again, you're self-conscious about your interactions. Meaning arises within interaction. So socially constructed, not instinctual. So we talked about this in many ways, that basically the meaning that we derive isn't necessarily innate. It's from the kind of social interactions that we have. So in essence, meanings can change. So if you take, I don't know, Christmas, for example, which is coming up, many, many years ago, obviously Christmas was more aligned to its perhaps religious precepts, right? But today, it's become very commercialized and commodified. So it's radically different. So meanings can interaction and change. Okay, we think about symbols, devise them, modify them, use them. So symbols are very important. Symbols can be the words, the gestures, objects, and we impose meaning upon those things, right? We impose meaning upon symbols. So let's take, for example, a word can be a symbol, right? So take, for example, the word dog. If we hear the word dog, yes, it's a distinct animal. It represents an animal. But for some people, it might evoke the idea that dog is loyal or companionship. But then someone who's had a negative interaction with dogs might think fear, because they're scared of dogs. So in essence, we interact with these symbols. Again, it's to do with meaning. Okay, so in terms of Mead's developmental psychology, this is again another important aspect, and it really shaped aspects of the Chicago school. So he focused a lot of his study on child development. And in particular, he wanted to examine toddlers and the whole issue of developmental psychology. And so he wanted to see how young toddlers develop their self-awareness. And so he observed several things. So he said toddlers gain awareness of themselves through perceptions of how the mother, father perceive and address them. So in many ways, what we see with children is that when they see their parents say, for example, praising them, that imposes within them, they see meaning to that. So when a parent shouts at their child or praises their child, they interact and understand those meanings. So in essence, positive praise can be good, negative, like shouting or whatever, can basically, the child will interpret that. The other aspect is through play and imitation of roles. So children develop through play and imitation. So often they'll play, doctor, for example. So they'll understand the roles that occur. So there is a dynamic. There is one is the doctor and one is the patient. So they're understanding the significance of roles and how they interrelate. Then you've got things like games. As children get older, games become, the rules of games, and the significant point is the generalized other that occurs from games. So what he's trying to say is, take for example, when children get older, the games that they engage with become more complex. So for example, if they're 7 or 8 year old and they join a football team, what are they learning from that experience? Well, they're learning first that there are fixed rules within the game, and also they're learning that there's basically cooperation with your teammates, and basically that you have to follow certain rules, that your actions will affect the team. So in essence, children are developing some of the key points that they need for understanding their role in society. Okay, so Herbert Blumer, as we basically mentioned, coined symbolic interactionism in 1938. Obviously, symbolic interactionism, as we've talked about, is this approach to understanding the relationships, the interactions, and how we acquire meaning through these processes. So it's not about a large-scale examination of society as a whole. We're trying to focus on the intricate kind of relationships that take place. Now, in the first quote, this is the expansion of the quote that we looked at. It's worth trying to understand the significance, again, of what he was trying to say. That it's the idea of meaning being ascribed, right? So the first premise is that human beings act towards things on the basis of the meanings that the things have for them. So what he's trying to say is what we've talked about, the ascribing of meaning. So take, for example, the American flag. For an American citizen, that flag is not an innate object. It carries significant meaning that they believe is actually sacred. So in essence, what meaning have they attributed to it? Well, it's things like patriotism, nationality, things like ideology. It could represent their freedom and their whole civilization, right? So it's something that they respect. So you can't desecrate the American flag. But now someone who basically might have some ideological opposition, so like during the Vietnam War, often the American flag was seen as a kind of symbol of oppression, and sometimes you would have burning of the American flag. So what we can understand is that this object, the American flag, has no actually inherent value. It's a cloth with some stars and stripes sewed on. It means nothing. My jacket is a cloth, the exact same thing, right? But the American flag has different meaning. So this cloth has been imbued with specific meaning that carries meaning when people interact. So for Americans, they have this symbol means something, and it shapes their behavior, it shapes their life, their view to it. How they interact with this object is also dependent on that. So we talked again, obviously, about the second aspect, which is the construction of meaning. So in many ways, we attach value, we attach meaning to things, and that shapes our interaction. So in many ways, take, for example, a gift. A gift we give to someone, it symbolizes something, perhaps affection and love. But in certain societies, what we have is that if you give an excessive gift, a very expensive gift, that's actually a sign of deep affection. While in other societies, if you give an expensive, excessive gift, that's frowned upon. That's not seen as good. So again, the meaning, the act of giving is the same, but how we interpret that act differs based on our interactions, experience, culture, etc., right? So I think what we're trying to say is, when it comes to symbolic interactionism, the basis of it is how we interact with objects, environments, people, gives us experience, and that whole meaning that we generate shapes the interaction, shapes the experience. So this is why the study of interaction, the study of relationships, is critical in symbolic interactionism. That we create meaning, we interact based on that meaning, and that meaning can change over time. All right, so that's it in a kind of nutshell. I know we've run out of time.